listening to Overwatch League Daily, your daily source for Overwatch League news, scores, and more. Here's your host, KickedTripod.
Good morning, Overwatch League fans, and welcome to Overwatch League Daily, your daily source for Overwatch League news, scores, and opinions. I'm John KickedTripod Horstman, and here's your Overwatch League Daily episode for December 3rd, 2017. On today's show, one of the most anticipated games of the Overwatch League preseason is the Shanghai Dragons versus the Seoul Dynasty. I asked Kevin AVRL Walker and Matt Pixie Carroll on the show to give us a preview of this matchup. AVRL and Pixie are both Overwatch casters and analysts who have been commentating the English broadcast of the Overwatch Pacific Championship, among other APAC events. Overwatch League will begin with 12 teams, 9 from the US, 1 from Europe, and 2 from Asia Pacific. Right away, we'll get to see the 2 APAC teams go head-to-head. For many, the Seoul Dynasty are far and away the favorite to win the entire league. On August 22nd, the Dynasty revealed their roster that consisted of the majority of Lunatic High. The Lunatic High roster can boast of 2 Apex wins, but they also won the Seoul Cup. The Dynasty will also have what was Lunatic High's coaching roster. On the other side, you have the Shanghai Dragons. The Shanghai Dragons have signed players from all over China. For those who don't follow the Chinese Overwatch scene closely, there's a pretty big discrepancy about just how good this Shanghai Dragons roster is. Some have them rated in the top 3, others middle of the pack, and some even have them rated at the bottom with the San Francisco Shock and Boston Uprising. Today I'm joined by Overwatch commentator, analyst, and former coach Kevin AVRL Walker. I'm also joined by Matt Pixie Carroll. Both of my guests today are commentators for the Overwatch Pacific Championship and have excellent knowledge of the APAC scene. Let's talk about the Shanghai Dragons first. There are a lot of people who are unfamiliar with these players and therefore hesitant on where to rank the team. What do people need to know about this Shanghai roster to better shape their understanding of the team's skill now and their potential? Pixie, I'll let you go first.
What do people need to know about the Shanghai Dragons? I would say basically what's already been said, and that there are a lot of unknown factors about this team. There isn't a lot of information. There are some past results, and to be frank, a lot of those results are lackluster. These are not players who come from teams that have had, consistent top 4, top 2 performances within their local scenes, let alone internationally. However, the international benchmark we do have is the performance of the World Cup team, the Chinese team at Overwatch World Cup most recently, which was a top 8 finish. But the specifics of that and what exactly that means for this team is still kind of up for debate anyway. So I would say the thing to actually watch for people watching the match coming up against Seoul Dynasty is you want to be looking for this team's potential rather than just looking at their performance, because the performance may be good, may be bad. You may be able to say a lot about it. And there's no two ways about the fact that Seoul Dynasty are coming into this match favored anyway. People aren't expecting a great performance out of Shanghai Dragons. But look for what the potential is, because that is going to determine how far they can go. It may not be very far. It may not be a lot of potential. But this is the match where you're going to be able to at least see what that potential may be.
AVRL, what do you think?
First of all, thank you for having me on the show. So the Dragons roster is a really interesting one for people that follow and don't follow the Chinese scene, because if you don't follow the scene, you probably don't know the members anyway. But if you do, much like me, you're probably wondering why some of the members were picked and why a lot of the potential better talent wasn't. So first thing you'll notice is that no Miraculous Youngsters members made it onto the team. Based on reports, Late Young was the only member of MY to trial for the Dragons, and he didn't make it despite being largely considered the best flex tank player in China. So you'll also want to notice that the head coach of the Dragons is U4, who was also the head coach of LGD. So Dragons is a roster that was built during the spring season of the Overwatch Premier Series and kind of finalized or roughly finalized by the Shanghai World Cup stage when LGD was still the top team or one of the best teams in China. So of the LGD roster, Undead, MG, and Altering are on the team. Eileen and Shy didn't make it onto the team due to age restrictions. They're both underage, but they're both considered top players in the scene anyway. So Eileen's a top projectile DPS player and Shy is a top support player. Both will remain on the LGD roster for the contender season next year. And I'll talk about the impact of losing those two players on Dragons a bit later. But Dia and Five King from Vici and Team CC respectively, both solid picks. Dia considered a pretty top hit scan player in his own right, and Five King we've seen already on Team China, who is very good. The FTD members, Roshan and Freefeel, are kind of question marks in my books. Not too sure on these members. I do feel there probably were better picks out there. Zushu from 1246 is another question mark, especially when you consider his teammate from 1246, Simp4, wasn't picked for the team. And this is where we got to go back to Eileen, because where are the Genji players? You have Dia and Undead, who are both very, very good hit scan players, but there is not a single notable star Genji player on the team, which is really interesting because, again, Simpfall, who is probably one of the remaining members that you thought would be picked, especially if Zushu was picked, isn't on the team. Leave, we already know, wasn't considered along with most of MY, and Eileen, of course, is underage, so the Dragons roster is going to be a really interesting one. Hard to tell how good it's going to be, but I kind of have the same sentiment with this roster compared to, say, teams like Boston, where you feel like a couple of the members, or a large amount of the members, you didn't expect to be on the roster, and you kind of feel there's a lot better talent remaining in the scene that could have been on the roster instead.
So I understand that this is completely speculation, but based on your knowledge, where do you expect Shanghai to finish in this Overwatch League?
Based only on past results, again, you kind of run into that same issue where there aren't a lot of past results, and a lot of them are not very recent, and a lot of them are not very good looking. Where do I think they'll finish? A lot of people in their power rankings have kind of put this team very much in the middle. There have been some people that have rated them quite a bit higher, some that have rated them a lot lower, but personally, I feel like this is a team that is going to probably finish in the lower half of the tournament. I think the big factor that'll actually determine it isn't necessarily their own performance. I think what is actually going to determine how high or low they end up being within that bottom half is actually going to be the performance of the other teams that have unknown factors about them. And what I mean by that is, take a look at, for example, Florida Mayhem being one of the teams that has a few questions about them. If Florida Mayhem end up really impressing, or whatever ends up happening over the course of Overwatch League, and they, start pushing like a top 8, top 5 finish maybe, then I see teams like Shanghai Dragons specifically being very, very low down in the rankings. If some of those other teams with unknown factors, for example, Florida Mayhem, really struggle in this league against some of the other rosters around there, for whatever reasons, then I see Shanghai Dragons maybe kind of hovering around that middle of the pack, more around 8th place kind of finish.
It's still reasonably unclear where the Dragons will finish. As you've already mentioned, people have placed Dragons kind of all over the board. Top 3, middle of the pack, bottom of the table, everything's kind of been there already. For me, personally, based on what's already been said, on some of the analysis of the players already, perhaps not being the best representation of the top talent in China, I'm expecting the Dragons to finish in the bottom half of Season 1, but along with many of the other sort of pickup rosters, you could see the Dragons really step it up towards the end of the season and reach middle of the pack status. So one thing that's really interesting to look at for the Dragons roster is they're in the Pacific Division of the Overwatch League, so their biggest competition there is the Seoul Dynasty and Dallas Fuel. The other two LA teams, I think, is going to be really close, and the San Fran team is also going to be in that mix as well. So you may likely see the Dragons finishing at the bottom with San Fran in the early stages in the Pacific Division and maybe stepping up later. So I think that's just generally kind of the advantage of having a full roster being picked up for the Overwatch League versus a pickup roster with individual members across many different teams. The full rosters are going to have that built-in synergy, and they're going to be much more well prepared, and the new rosters will need a lot more time. The other factor to note for the Shanghai Dragons that doesn't necessarily apply for a lot of the other teams is the fact that they are a full Chinese roster playing in Los Angeles, so there may be some cultural difficulties there that don't even necessarily exist for the Korean teams, because technically there are 3 full Korean rosters. So I think for the Korean players, they have the opportunity to, I guess, feel at home a bit more with, more interaction between, people that they already know. For the Chinese, they're kind of there by themselves, and there is a possibility that they might find it difficult to kind of stay in an unfamiliar territory, but not only that, but maybe difficult to even find scrims. I feel a lot of the Western teams will favor each other, and the Korean teams will likely be scrimming themselves as well. So where China lies in that, we'll have to see later on, but I'm not expecting the Dragons to make playoffs.
What about the Seoul Dynasty? Do you think that they are as good as everyone seems to be making them out to be?
Seoul are definitely one of the teams most deserving of their praise, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who doesn't currently have them in the top 4 already of the first Overwatch League season. So not only that, but I think Seoul Dynasty are also favored to win the entire season. If you look at a lot of the problems that the old Lunatic High roster had before they became Seoul, it had mostly to do with the DPS lineup. So between Iska, Guido, Lee Tae-jun, and Huayu, there were definitely problems with both flexibility and their raw mechanics. So since then, Seoul have picked up 5 DPS players. Without even looking at Guido, Weekid, or Bunny, Fleder and Munchkin themselves could already cover most of the bases that were kind of lacking in the original Lunatic High roster, and that is without even, again, addressing the other 3 members yet. So when you then add in the other 3 DPSs, Seoul has extreme flexibility in the DPS spot. When you then combine that again with arguably the best support line in the game, it's definitely a force to be reckoned with. So the only remaining question for the roster is, how does Miro and Kuki get slotted in? Because the tanks now are the only outlier for the team, compared to, say, rosters like London, who have Fisher and Gesture both, and are arguably considered to be the top 2 tanks in the world. So that question will need to be answered later, but for now, Seoul definitely look like playoffs material, if not a league-winning team.
Seoul Dynasty, yeah, they're as good as people make them out to be. There's really no 2 ways about that. Whether they're actually, guaranteed top 3, it's a little bit more questionable, mainly because, the season is long, you never know what's going to happen. But certainly top 5, I think, should be pretty expectable. The one thing that is worth saying, though, is the bones of this team is Lunatic High, and, of course, that coaching infrastructure as well, which is tried and true insofar as they have had some incredible performances, but more recently, they have not been the strongest team in Korea. That is an honor that kind of has to go to GC Busan right now, who are currently on the London Spitfires roster. So you do have to consider that. That being said, for a time, it was Lunatic High that was in GC Busan's current shoes, right? So maybe the wheel turns again. Maybe this is the roster that ends up back on top. Maybe it's someone new altogether. We really don't know. In fact, if anything, we can expect that that's more likely going to happen than anything else, right? But I think it is very much fair to say that, yes, this is an almost guaranteed top 5 finish team. If they don't, it's because something absolutely bonkers has happened, at which point every prediction would have gone right out the window anyway, and there is a very, very good chance this is going to be a top 3 team.
So if you're a coach for the Seoul Dynasty, you're going in against the Shanghai Dragons week 1, what are you focusing on to prepare for this matchup?
Seoul definitely start with one of the easier matches in the preseason, and taking that into regard, it's unlikely that they will be running their starting lineup against Shanghai. Something which was revealed very recently was that every single player on a team's roster must be showcased in the preseason somewhere in a match. With an 11-team roster like Seoul, you're likely to see the sub lineup for Seoul versus Shanghai first, while they save their starting lineup for a tougher match, probably in their second preseason game. That compounded by the fact that there isn't a strong incentive for necessarily winning in the preseason, Seoul's focus will be to show off their strength without giving away all their secrets. Play your jacks and queens for now, save your ace for later, and definitely do not show your full hand.
And yeah, if I was the coach for Seoul Dynasty, I would basically say the same thing. I would say just, stick to your guns, play your beats, but I would say it for quite a different reason. I would say it for this team because they are a known quantity, right? I would say it because they are tried and true, and they know that they can play a good game of Overwatch. And I would tell them to just play that good game of Overwatch. Again, if they can walk away feeling like they have played the best game of Overwatch they possibly can, that is the most important thing, because there is high expectation on this team. They don't need to even 3-0. They don't need to do anything except stay calm and stay self-confident, because it is an earned confidence. And if that confidence is what underpins this team, there is nothing that can happen to this team that could ever shake that. And it means no matter how rough things get, in the mid-season or whatever happens, they will always have the bones of a top 5 finishing team. So for this first match, they really just need to play a solid game of Seoul Dynasty Overwatch.
So what about the Shanghai Dragons? How are you going to prepare for that match as a coach?
If I was the coach for Shanghai Dragons, I would be telling this team to just kind of play to the beats, stick to their guns, don't do anything fancy, don't do anything crazy. I would just want them to implement whatever it is we've been working on. And again, if I was that coach, what I would have been working on would have just been basically just playing solid Overwatch. I wouldn't be trying to work on anything too fancy. I wouldn't even be looking too deeply into the matchup and, doing all this huge research on Lunatic High and going, okay, what can we do to beat this team? Like, normally I would say a coach should absolutely be doing that, but for this team, I think it is most important that they establish a good baseline. No matter what happens in this match, win or lose, they need to have played the best game of Overwatch they feel they could have possibly played that day, because that is going to determine what they can build from moving forward. It's going to be able to determine how consistent they can be in the long run. I feel like that is far, far more important for them to do than try and eke out some crazy map win because they have some wacky strategy. Establish a baseline for this matchup.
I think it's important for China to focus on what their strengths are, with Undead no doubt at the center of that team's roster. So funneling resource into the DPS line between both Undead and Dia will be very important for the team, since they're both top hitscan players in China. Building compositions specifically around those two players should be a focus. Right now, the Dragons need to be more focused internally on themselves before really looking outwards to other teams. As one of the new pickup rosters in Overwatch League, they need to spend more time working on synergy and gelling together than a team like Seoul. They'll also know they're not favored versus Seoul, so their goal should be to give their best performance possible without necessarily going out of their way to counter-strat the other team, especially not at the cost of leaving their own comfort zone.
So last question then, and I think you've already answered it, but let's just make sure. Who do you think wins this matchup?
I think with everything said previously, this should be a pretty straightforward answer. Seoul will definitely win versus Shanghai, but how close the match is going to be will be a big question mark. I do expect Shanghai to try a lot harder than Seoul, so that's something to take into place, but nevertheless, Shanghai is not favored in this matchup at all.
Yeah, that's got to be Seoul Dynasty. There's no two ways about that. Look, top 5 finisher or no, this is a great team. We know that this is a great team. Even just comparing recent results when Korean teams, not even including Lunatic High, have played against Chinese teams, it has always gone the way of Koreans. And there are very good reasons for that, reasons which I'm not quite going to go into here. But it's pretty well accepted, and I think rightfully so, that this is going to be the winning team here. And even if it's not a big win, or even if it is a massive win, that's not going to actually say all that much. The only thing that could say anything significant is if for some reason Seoul Dynasty don't win. If Seoul Dynasty don't win, all bets are off, right? So yeah, Seoul Dynasty take it.
And with that, that's going to do it for episode 5. Episode 6 will release on Wednesday, December 6th, where I'll be joined by Uber to kick off the preseason. And with the end of this show, that's going to do it for the first week of Overwatch League Daily. I can't thank you all enough for tuning in and making this first week such an amazing experience. I can't wait to keep working on these for you going forward. And remember, you can find this show on any of your favorite podcast outlets, including iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Podcasts. We're also on YouTube. Click on the link in the show notes below to find us. Last but not least, want to stay in touch? Email me at overwatchleaguedaily@gmail.com or tweet me at OWL Daily Show. You can also join our Discord at discord.me/OWL Daily Show. That's going to do it for episode 5. We'll see you on Wednesday.